Hoćemo li kolege? Možemo i da čekamo ovdje napravimo. Evo imamo marš. Marš, zato bi se
može nego i kamera, ne znam, evo što možda vi sedite, ali morate da budete...
Ajde, da jedino, hoćeš da prebacimo ovu stvar? Evo, imati
kamere, hoću kamera, ne, kamera, zbog snimanja. Kako se počinjete? Počinjete.
Kad je najlakše da smo počeli?
Samo da počnemo.
Najlepša boja, kako da ne
Let's start. So, I will address insertion. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So, dobar dan svima, hvala vam što ste se odnosili pozivu na predavanje. Ovo je prvo predavanje našeg predkonferencijskog programa koje je namenjeno studentima i profesorima našeg fakulteta. I sa nama je Parncutt, uvaženi gost, profesor sa Univerziteta u Grazu, on je direktor Centra za Musicology, ali samo da malo možda ste pročitali, možda niste, kažem, some biographical details. Dakle, kao što sam rekla, je vode Centar za sistemsku muzikologiju u istom univerzitetu. On je i važan član ESCOM organizacije koja u stvari podržava i koja je inicirala ovu našu konferenciju i ESCOM predstavnik u Srbiju i tako nekako sve i počelo. On je prošle godine bio predsednik, sad ima poziciju, da kažemo, prethodnog predsednika i organizuje tu veoma važnu konferenciju koja je objedinila praktično 4 mesta dešavanja na 4 kontinenta. On je inače iz Australije, tamo je završio u Melbourneu zvanje matera fizike, zatim diplomacije psihologije, muzike i fizike i dakle ima veoma divergentno obrazovanje i interesovanje. U svojim istraživanjima bavi se muzičkim strukturama, visine konsonance, harmonija, tonalnost, tenzija, ritam, međas, akcent, muzičkim izvođenjem, psihologija, klavir, primene znanja u različitim aspektima primenjenih disciplina, poreklom se bavi poreklom tonalnosti i muzike koja je muzikološkom interdisciplinarnošću. I to se uključuje discipline kao što su psihologija muzike, teorija muzike, akustika, psihoakustika, istraživanje zvuka i muzike, kompjuterskim programima, procese memorisanja, sociologiju, filozofiju, istoriju, etnomuzikologiju, muzičko obrazovanje. All that! And objavljuje knjige i publikuje u svetskim vrhunskim časopisima. Eto, ja vas molim da pozdravimo.
Okay, so hi everybody. I hope you can hear me. I will try to talk so that you can understand. I hope that's good enough. Thank you, Parncutt, for organising this and for inviting me. And I was just talking to your dean about how students in this faculty are very good at music theory and ear training, and therefore that's a good start for understanding this talk. So I'm going to talk about music theory, what you think is music theory, and I'm going to ask questions which maybe you don't normally ask, and I'm going to give new answers that maybe you don't know. So my claim is that there are some very important and simple ideas in music theory which are incorrect and need to be corrected. And so after this talk you will have some idea what this means. So I'm going to talk about some very basic, simple things. What is a pitch? What is an interval? What is a scale? Where do these things come from? What is a chord? how do we perceive a chord? What is consonance and what is tonality? So these are obvious things that you know about, all right, okay? Well, you think you know about them. And my talk is confined to so-called Western music. I'm not sure exactly where the boundary is, but it's not about Asian music or African music. And it's also confined to music made from harmonic complex tones, or approximately harmonic, like the tones on the piano. And music that you can play in the chromatic scale. And the chromatic scale means 12 tones per octave, approximately, not exactly tuned to something. 12 tones per octave, right? That's what we're talking about today. So I'm going to start by asking this question, what is a pitch? Because the word pitch is used in different ways in music theory, and sometimes it's a bit ambiguous, right? Sometimes it has more than one meaning. I'm going to say in this talk that the pitch of a tone is the perceived height of a sound, and that means that if I hear a tone, I hear another tone, and I say the first one is higher or lower because I perceive it as higher or lower, right? Or I perceive a tone and I say that sounds very high. This is a subjective judgment. It's not necessarily the same as frequency, which is a physical measurement. So I want you to keep this in mind. If you're tuning your violin and you have a tuning fork, the tuning fork goes bing, and you tune the violin, and you think that the pitch is the same, it's not necessarily the same frequency, right? Because pitch and frequency are actually a little bit different, and they are different in many different ways. So we're focusing on the subjective world of experience of pitch. And I should also emphasize that pitch is not the same as a musical note. So here we have a picture of a musical note. If you are playing your violin and you see this note, you play the note, right? If you play that note in a certain context, in a piece of music, it might be a little bit higher or lower depending on the context, right? So this tells us that a note is not the same as a pitch. But a pitch is also not the same as a frequency. They're three different things. So I try to separate them. So the next question I want to ask is, what is a scale? Now we're starting with very basic stuff. Now you think a scale is maybe something you write in music notation. Well, here's an example of a scale on the right. Maybe you can't see this very clearly, but so this is a makam scale which has some quarter tones in it from Turkish music. Is that a scale, what you see written down? Well, I'm going to use the word scale in the following sense. It's a psychological and cultural phenomenon, right? A scale is something which comes out of cultural history. It develops gradually. We don't know where it starts. So if you say, okay, where does the diatonic scale come from? Some people will say, okay, it used to be pentatonic and someone added 2 more notes, right? But it's maybe a bit like that, but there might be a history in ancient Mesopotamia which we don't know about, how the diatonic scale developed. In any case, it's a product of cultural history. And it depends how you perform, right? So originally scales are for vocal music mainly, and then the instruments came along, and then probably the tuning of the scale steps was changed by the use of instruments, because the instruments do something, right? And then people had to perceive and remember the scale, and then they had to pass it on from one generation to the next. And so all of these things tell us that a scale is essentially a psychological and cultural phenomenon, or we could say psychocultural, if you wanted to invent a new word. So the next thing, which might be rather simple, this is basic psychoacoustics, right? What does a tone sound like? What is the subjective experience of a tone? And normally in psychoacoustics we say a tone has pitch, which is the subjective pitch, how high it sounds in your subjective perception. Loudness, which is also subjective, different from a physical measurement. Timbre, which is also completely subjective, it depends on many different physical parameters. And the perceived duration. And today, because I'm talking about music theory, I'm going to focus only on pitch. We talk only about pitch today. What happens when the ear hears a tone? So now we get into psychology. So you know our ear has an outer ear and a middle ear and an inner ear, and in the inner ear there's something called the cochlea, and inside there is a membrane called the basilar membrane, and the membrane vibrates, and a low tone makes one end of the membrane vibrate, and a high tone makes the other end, and all this. Anyway, there is a machine in your head called the inner ear which separates the high and the low frequencies. And so we know from psychoacoustic experiments that when you hear a normal tone on the piano, that's actually when you hear this normal tone, you think there's only one tone, right? There's only one tone, but your ear is separating that tone into harmonics. And the message that goes from your ear to the brain on the auditory nerve contains separate harmonics. Maybe 10, maybe like in this picture, not that many. In this picture it goes up to number 16. Can I use this mouse? Yes, it goes up to number 12 here. Well, depending on the relative amplitude of the harmonics, you might be able to hear 7 or 10. So today I'm going to say you can hear 10, right? It's not completely true because sometimes it's only 3 and sometimes it's 13. But I'll say today you can hear 10, which goes up to this 10th harmonic, a major third above 2 octaves. All right, so there's a strange thing about the pitch of a tone, and that is that we hear only one pitch, but we know that the ear can separate the frequencies, right? And that's because something is happening in your brain to put the tone back together. And what happens then is that the pitch is ambiguous. So the pitch is ambiguous. Now, if I sing a tone, ba, and then I whistle a tone, which I can't do. Now you might think I'm whistling one octave above, right? Ba. Or I could sing this one, ba. Now you might say that's the same tone, but someone else might say this ba is the same tone, right? I mean, they sound similar. Tones an octave apart sound similar. Now that actually means that the pitch is a bit ambiguous. When you play a pure tone and then you hear someone singing in the opera, it's very hard to know if they're in the same octave or not. So there's something called the ambiguity of the octave. And I have a picture here to illustrate this. I should explain it carefully so you know what it is. All right, so the top picture is a spectrum. This is the piano keyboard. There's the lowest note on the piano, and the highest note on the piano is here. And the highest note you can hear is here, right? So this is middle C. Do you call it C1 in this country? Yes. C1. Okay, middle C, that's this one. Here, right? And these are the harmonics. Harmonics number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Going like this. So this is a physical representation showing the harmonics which are physically present in the tone. In the second picture we see the pitch that you might hear. And the biggest peak on this graph is the pitch corresponding to the fundamental frequency, and that is like you normally hear the pitch in the right place, right? But it's also possible to hear the pitch an octave above, because the second harmonic could be the first harmonic of a different series of harmonics. There's a harmonic series inside of the tone which is an octave higher. And so it's quite normal to hear the pitch an octave higher. And you can also hear the pitch an octave lower. And so I'm trying to say here that the pitch is a bit ambiguous. And if you don't believe that's true, you can do a simple experiment where people hear 2 tones. And I say, okay, oh dear, not that tone again. And I ask, how similar are the tones? Now, a musician will say, that's a crazy question, no idea what you mean. How similar are those tones? If I ask non-musicians, they cannot recognize the intervals, and they just answer. I can play some tones like a trumpet and some like a clarinet, and then I can change the interval. I can do lots of things, and in the end I find out that non-musicians who cannot recognize intervals, they think an octave interval is more similar than a major 7 or a minor 9. And the reason why they think it's more similar is because the harmonics are overlapping, or more precisely the pitches are overlapping, right? So two tones an octave apart have pitches in common. So that's an interesting concept which we're going to come back to. One of the foundations of music theory is that tones have something in common when they're in a harmonic interval. Now I'm going to start talking about consonants, and so consonants is very important in Western music theory, and it's a very long tradition of talking about consonants. Normally we think that consonants is about chords and intervals, right? And there's a long history in music theory talking about which intervals are consonant and which are dissonant, and why is that, and is the perfect fourth interval consonant or dissonant, and all of that stuff, right? So now I'm going to claim today that every single tone has consonants and dissonants, and you might think that's a bit weird. Let's consider the Western tradition of chant, sometimes called Gregorian chant. Those guys there with the black clothes, they were singing chant for many centuries in Western Catholic churches without any notation. It was an oral tradition. They learned it by ear, they sang the songs, they learned the texts, and only later people started to write them down, because you know this story, Guido d'Arezzo invented some idea about graphical notation, and after that people started to write the chants down. Right? Before that it was completely an oral tradition, and these chants are almost entirely diatonic. Diatonic means you can play them on the white notes of the piano in transposition. Right? We're not sure exactly the absolute pitch. And when I say the white notes of the piano, I don't mean exactly equal temperament. I mean approximately the white notes of the piano. Okay? I don't care if it's any kind of tuning. It's just approximately equal spaced. All right? Now, here's a very interesting thing. Some tones in chant happen more often than others. So if I'm a monk and I'm singing da 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 da, you might think that I'm selecting any tone out of the diatonic scale, and every tone is equal. Right? You would think they're all equal. Well, in fact, they're not equal. According to this graph, if you look at the black line here, the black line is how often each tone happens. The tone G happens more often than any other tone, and the tone B, which we call Ha in German, do you call it Ha? We call it, yeah, okay. The tone B or H, right, happens the least often. This black line is when we count all of the tones in hundreds of chants. I found a book where some people a long time ago wrote many chants in a book, and I just counted the tones, right? So the tone G happened most often. This line up here, the broken line, is the final tone. So maybe you're familiar with the idea that the final tone of a chant is often G, because the mode on G is quite a common mode. But for the purpose of this talk, I just want to talk about all of the tones. The tone G happens most often, followed by the tone F, followed by the tone B and A and C. And an interesting point is that C happens more often than B, and E, F happens more often than E. The mode on E happens more often than the mode on F. The tone F happens more common than the tone E. That is really quite remarkable. So if that's true, and the differences are enormous. Look, this is 0 here, right? This is 0, 100, 200. I'm counting the tones. The differences are enormous between G and B. Look how big the difference is. If that's true, we should try to find a reason for that. And I would like to claim that the tone G is more consonant, and the tone B is more dissonant, and that the monks who were singing these chants intuitively had a feeling for the consonants and dissonance of each tone, because what were they doing? They were expressing the word of God with sound, and that was beautiful. They were creating something that was intended to be beautiful, so of course they focused on the most consonant tones. Now, why would one tone be more consonant than the others? Well, here are the harmonics of G, which go like this. These notes here, right? And here are the harmonics of B, which you call Ha, and the harmonics of B have some sharps in them. and the sharps are not part of the diatonic scale. So you see that there is the overlap between the harmonics of G and the diatonic scale is almost perfect, right? Approximately, I mean, the tuning is not a problem, right? They're approximately the same on the piano, right? And for the tone B, there are a lot of harmonics which are audible according to psychoacoustics, but they clash with the diatonic scale. And so that means the tone B, in the context of the diatonic scale, is more dissonant than the tone G. And that would be why the monks were avoiding that tone. So here is a prediction based on that theory. The theory simply says, out of the 10 audible harmonics in a tone, how many octave equivalent with the diatonic scale step or something. And the theory predicts that G is the most common tone, followed by C, D, F, and A, and then E is a bit less common, and B is the least common tone, and that corresponds approximately to the data. Not perfectly, because in different traditions there are variations in the Gregorian chant tradition about this. So here is another picture of how often tones happen. I asked this question. Oh, I haven't. I should have asked the following question. The question I'm asking is, which tones happen more often and why? Right? So I already talked about the Gregorian chant, which tones happen more often. But of course, in tonal music, some tones happen more often than others as well. And these pictures are based on regular major minor tonal music. Perhaps you know about Carol Parncutt, who is a famous music psychologist, and this is the famous result that she found. When she published this in 1980, everyone said, how naive. But then after a while, people realized this is like the foundations of music theory, so we should talk about it. So she said, if we're in the key of C major, C, D, E, and here's the leading tone B, which we call Ha, C is the most common tone, and C is also the tone which goes best with a chord progression. So if I just play a chord progression like this, and then I play one tone, and I ask some psychologists or some non-musicians to tell me, does the tone go with the chord progression? They'll say, yes, that one goes with the chord progression. And then I do this again. I play a different tone, which is a bit out of tune, but I'll try this one. Play a different tone, and they say, no, it goes badly, right? So it's a very naive question. And you get these data, you find out that C, E, and G are the tones of the tonic triad, and they go best, right? And the tone F, which is obviously like the subdominant, goes well, and the tones that belong to the diatonic scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, go well, but the tone B goes rather badly, the leading tone, which corresponds to the music theory idea of instability, right? The tone which is unstable goes badly, and you can draw the same picture for the minor, and the principle works the same. So what I want to tell you is the principle for major and minor music is completely different from the principle for chant, right? In the case of chant, I've tried to explain the frequency of occurrence of tones with the audible harmonics and the diatonic scale. In this case, there's a completely different principle, and I'm going to come back to it. I'm not going to tell you the answer yet, because I want you to be very excited and wait until the end of the talk. All right, so before we do that, I'm coming back to another very fundamental music theory question. What is an interval? Okay, now you might be surprised that there's a question. Why would I ask that question? The reason is music theorists have been talking for centuries and millennia, thousands of years, about what an interval is, and I think most of it was untrue. So let me explain why. So here is the major third interval, right? That is the music notation, and it sounds like this, right? So what is that thing? Well, here are three different possible tunings of the interval. I drew a graph here. 400 cents is 4 semitones, right? This is the equal tempered tuning of the major third. I also call this 12 EDO, 12 equal divisions of the octave, right? if you take 12 equal divisions of the octave, this is a major third with 400 cents. And there's two very common tunings which are used in music theory. One is called Pythagorean, and one is called just or pure tuning. Pythagorean is made up of perfect fifth intervals. So a Pythagorean major third is like you take 4 perfect fifths, and then you get the major third by adding up perfect fifths and taking away octaves. And the just or pure major third is the ratio 5/4, which is the distance between harmonics number 5 and 4. And the just or pure major third is smaller than the equal tempered one, and the Pythagorean major third is bigger. Okay? So these are like basics of tuning theory. Now, if you measure in real performances what people are doing, it doesn't actually correspond to that, right? So a psychologist will say, that's fine, but we want to know what actually happens. What happens when the people get on the stage and they're playing in an ensemble and they're playing their trumpet and their violin and they're singing in their barbershop quartet or whatever, their Renaissance, or they're singing Gregorian chant. What actually happens with those musical intervals? And the first answer to this question is the intonation, even in the best world-class music performance, is not that accurate, right? It's very unusual that people can get so close to the middle of this that you can't even decide which one of these tunings they're using most of them, right? People have to play very exactly and very slowly and with no vibrato before you can even tell if they're on the left side or the right side of that thing in the middle, okay? So that's the first thing you find out, and the second thing you find out is that it's not clear which one of these is the right one, Pythagorean or pure, because sometimes people play the major third a little bit bigger, and that's typical for violins. That might be if the leading tone is going up, you want to make it go up, right? Or if you're conducting your choir, you make sure that they sing their major triad clearly major so that you don't hear minor, so you exaggerate the difference between major and minor, right? This makes so-called Pythagorean tuning where the major third is bigger, and the other option is when you're playing very slowly, you want to avoid beating between the audible harmonics, and many people talk about this, and therefore they play the major third a bit smaller, right? But that actually doesn't mean the major third is one or the other of those things, right? What is a major third? Now this is not data, this is just something I made up, but I think that if someone does this experiment, maybe one of you will do this experiment. You have to take many recordings of real music and measure the major third thousands of times. You will not find that it's sometimes pure and sometimes Pythagorean, like this. This is the number of times it happens, and this is the size of the interval, right? This is called a bimodal distribution in psychology. You will not find this. You will find this. You'll find that on average it's something in the middle, right? And so, and that being the case, we realise that the major third interval is not a ratio. It's not a ratio, it's a distance, and it's an uncertain distance. There's a range of error. So let me try to convince you that musical intervals are not ratios. The reason I'm doing this is because there's a very long history of music theory. People saying again and again, musical intervals are ratios, right? You know this from Pythagoras, but everyone in the Pythagorean tradition. So here we have a table of 12 intervals, perfect unison up to the octave, and these are the notes relative to C, C sharp, D, D sharp, or E flat, right? And these are the number of semitones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 12. And these are two different intervals for each, the pure or just interval and the Pythagorean interval. So the major third can be 5/4, which is the pure interval, or it can be 81/64, which is the Pythagorean. So you see that most intervals have two versions, and the argument about major thirds is exactly the same for every other interval. We cannot, by an experiment in psychology, we cannot tell you which one is the right one. Okay? We don't know. So the question is, maybe neither of them is the right one. What is a musical interval? It corresponds approximately to a ratio, but it is not a ratio itself. Instead, it is a learned, subjective, approximate distance between two pitches. And where do we learn the intervals from? Our own experience in our life. We hear a lot of pianos in our life, which probably explains why we like the tuning of the piano. Now, many people will tell you the piano is out of tune, and I'm not talking about this note, which is obviously I mean, even if the piano is perfectly tuned with 12 equally spaced tones in an octave, people will tell you actually it's out of tune because it does not correspond exactly to ratios, right? And when they say that to you, they mean an interval is a ratio, right? And the thing we want to do is a ratio. I'm telling you this is not true. An interval is a learned subjective approximate distance. And the correct intonation is what works right in music performance. And what works right in a music performance depends on many factors, right? So we talked already about avoiding beating. Usually you cannot hear the beating, right? That's only in a very special case. Another idea is that you want to show that the leading tone is going to rise by something about the implication of movement. Well, that would be one of many possible criteria. So the optimal interval size depends on the context and is learned from oral tradition. And there's you've got a brain in your head, right? So how does your brain do this? Well, your brain has something inside called neural networks. And neural networks are very complex. They have enormous numbers of neurons in them, like mega, gigantic, unbelievably large numbers, right? And these large numbers of neurons store information about the timing of and about the spectral aspects, it's called the temporal and spectral aspects. Physics, right? Boring. And they just remember stuff, right? So you play lots and lots of music to these neural networks and they just remember stuff and they learn it. And that's where the interval comes from. It's stored in your brain in a neural network. So what about ratio theory? I have said very bad things about it, and I apologize to anybody who has a strong emotional relationship to ratio theory. I realize that it's a sensitive topic, but I really have to just make my statement so you understand what I'm going to say. So you know the idea of harmony of the spheres. For many hundreds of years, people believe there's a connection between the planets going around and our perception of music. And the reason they thought that is because music is wonderful and magical and has strong emotional connotations, and we don't know where they come from. And then we look at the sky at night time and we see the beauty of the stars and we see the planets moving around and we think that it's created by God. And so of course we make this connection, right? So I can understand why people did this for many centuries, and not only in Western culture, also in other musical cultures, this connection. But in fact, it's not true, you see. In fact, there's no connection whatsoever between the motion of the planets and the human tradition of playing music with intervals which are tuned according to complex criteria, completely different things. Equal temperament is not out of tune. So this guy here wrote a book called How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony and Why You Should Care. So his thesis is that equal temperament is the worst thing that ever happened. Now, you know what you learn in school is that Johann Sebastian Bach decided, or his friend, someone, decided they would make the tones equal so they could play in all different keys, right? Major and minor keys. Well, that's true. But also, there's an additional point, and that is that every tuning of every interval in any context is a compromise between different criteria, and there's no exact tuning. And what this guy's saying is actually not true. He says nobody notices how awful the major thirds are. Right? What I'm saying is a just major third and an equal temperate major third and a Pythagorean, they're all okay, right? I like all of them. musical consonants cannot be reduced to temporal patterns in the brain. So there's a famous German mathematician in the 18th century called Leibniz, who explained to everybody that the wonderful emotions in music and the joy that music gives to us is because there are waves going up and down in your brain, and sometimes they coincide and sometimes they don't, right? This is absolutely not true, because now I'm not going to tell you about the psychology of musical emotion, but if you read about the last few decades of research on this topic, you won't see any of that, right? A musical emotion comes from somewhere else. Ratios don't explain chords. So maybe you know the idea that a major triad has a ratio, 4 to 5 to 6, right? 4, 5, 6. So that's the ratio of one chord. That sounds very logical because you hear the major triad inside the harmonic series between the harmonics number 4, 5, and 6. But what about the minor triad? Well, it's 20, it's 10, oh, what? Oh, minor triad. 10 to 12 to 15, right? What are these numbers, right? What about 5, 6, 7, or 7, 6, 7, 8, right? What kind of theory is that? But these weird numbers kind of jump out. I don't think they explain anything. All right. We don't perceive the simplicity of a ratio. Some psychologists claimed that infants and adults can process information more easily if the tones correspond to ratios, but actually it's not true. What actually happens is that if you hear music in a familiar scale and you heard the intervals before, then it's familiar and then it's easier, right? So the familiarity helps, but not the ratios. There's a very famous experiment about the consonance and dissonance of two pure tones. I should have a sound example, I'm sorry about that. If you imagine two pure tones and you play them at the same time and you ask about the consonance or dissonance, the result depends only on the distance between them. So here the two pure tones have an interval of 0, and the interval gets bigger and bigger as you go up here. For a large interval between two pure tones, you hear no roughness, and the consonance goes up to the maximum. For a small interval like 1 or 2 semitones, the consonance becomes a minimum. There are no ratios in these data, right? So for complex tones, of course, you get ratios because the harmonics are overlapping, right? But for pure tones, there are no overlapping harmonics and there are no ratios. I'm going to skip that. So this is no news, actually, because the ancient Greeks already knew what I'm saying. You think I'm saying something radical, but that Aristoxenus was this guy in the 4th century before the Christian era. At the time, the Pythagoreans were big, right? And he said, the Pythagoreans are wrong. All that stuff about numbers is not about real music. The knowledge of magnitudes, by which he means the numbers, does not enlighten one as to the functions of the tetrachords, which is the foundation of Greek music theory. He said, basically, if you want to understand music, you have to play it, and you have to understand the process of playing and perceiving. Helmholtz in the 19th century also complained about people who build music theory based on ratios. He called it arithmetic mysticism. And Dalhaus, the 20th century musicologist, said, whereas in the ancient medieval tradition, number ratios were considered to be the foundation or formal cause of consonance, in modern acoustics and music theory, they paled to an external measure that says nothing about the essence of the matter. So what he means is the ratios that are supposed to represent intervals actually don't explain, right? The real explanation is somewhere else. So now you might be thinking about intonation. I should explain something about intonation in order to make it clear that musical intervals are not ratios. we have many experiments in the last few decades about intonation in music, and here is a summary of the results. The most preferred intonation in the best music by the best musicians is close to 12 equal divisions per octave, like the piano. So it doesn't matter actually what instrument they're playing or whether they're singing. This is the result that psychologists find when they measure the best performance. Pythagorean intonation, in which major thirds are a bit larger than equal temperament, is sometimes preferred and in certain situations, and sometimes smaller major thirds are preferred when people seem to be avoiding beating. And that's it. So this is what intonation depends on in real music. It depends on perception. I haven't mentioned octave stretch yet. In real music, people like octaves to be a little bigger than a ratio of 2 to 1. So the ratio 2 to 1 actually sounds a bit out of tune. I should have a sound demonstration. I'm sorry, but you can demonstrate this, right? So that means that most intervals are actually a bit bigger than the corresponding ratios. So intonation depends on cognition, the way you perceive the musical structure, the stability of the tones. Some tones are more stable and some are less stable. So the intonation depends on performance. Soloists usually play a bit sharp compared to the accompaniment, and when they do play a bit sharp, it sounds actually good. People like it. Some instruments have technical problems which change the intonation, but people get used to it because familiarity is the foundation of this whole theory. And of course, intonation also depends on interpretation, so you can play deliberately out of tune, if you want, in order to express emotion or to interpret with timbre or rising to a target pitch or something like this. So this is the real world of music, how our intonation works. What about quarter tones? They lie between half-tone steps. And the tuning of quarter tones is also approximate, just like the tuning of the half tones. In Eastern theories, like in Turkey and in the Middle East, there are theories of ratios, just like in Western music. And from a psychological perspective, these ratio theories are equally problematic. Because quarter tones are the same thing. It's a tradition which you learn by ear, and then you like it because you become familiar with it. What about enharmonic? So you're thinking, okay, sometimes we write C sharp and sometimes we write D flat. What exactly is the difference? Well, I'm going to claim today that there's no relationship between enharmonic spelling and pitch. And people find that quite surprising because many people think that G sharp is higher than A flat, right? So sometimes when you're playing the violin and you see G sharp, you would think it's a little bit higher than A flat. Well, that's actually true if you're playing Pythagorean, right? Oops, I'm going to fall over here. In Pythagorean tuning, G sharp is higher than A flat. But if you're playing in just tuning, which people sometimes seem to do, then G sharp is lower than A flat. And so actually you cannot say in general if they're higher or lower. You can just say there's something funny about the notation system, which means we have to change the name of the note. There's no particular reason to say there's a different note. What we can say is that the notation system cannot deal with this problem, and therefore the notation system presents us with a problem which actually is not necessarily in the music, it's in the notation system. So here's a nice example. You know this this prelude, I should play it. Oh, I can't play it. It sounds, oh, it's got that F sharp in it. So this is this chord here, right? So this is a famous chord at the end of the Chopin prelude in E minor, right? And it's got a B flat in the base. Now, Chopin could have written A sharp because normally we would say that's an A sharp. It's the lower chromatic neighbor of the dominant. It's like an augmented sixth kind of chord, right? Augmented sixth chord. Do you have those? He could have written A sharp or he could have written B flat. Now, some music theorists think it's important that he wrote B flat, and they explain, oh, that means he's imagining that it resolves to F major before it goes to this. Now, I think, well, that's not true, because you have to think about poor Mr. Chopin. He's sitting in front of his piano. He wants to finish his piece and take it to the publisher. He's got a choice. He can write B flat or A sharp. He just has to choose one of those two. And he doesn't say, and he didn't say anything about it. Maybe he didn't care. He just wrote B sharp. He wrote B flat. So, and I'm saying, well, the music notation system only gives him these two choices. He doesn't get a choice of writing down the black note at the top of the three black notes, right? Maybe if you got that choice, he would have said so. So we can imagine a world without enharmonics in which you have a music notation system based on 12 tones per octave. Now, I'm not going to tell you this is a good idea. I just want you to understand it would be possible. So in this music notation system, we have the black notes on the piano are the lines here, 3 lines together, and then we have 2 lines for the 2 black notes, right? So this is C sharp and D sharp, and this is F sharp and G sharp and A sharp, right? And we can write down this Mozart piano sonata, and we don't have to worry about enharmonics. Well, so it's possible to imagine a world like that, and what I'm saying is that from a scientific, psychological viewpoint, this is actually closer to reality than conventional notation. So when you read conventional notation, you should understand it in that way. That the difference between B flat and A sharp is a convention of writing notation. It's not a fundamental musical difference. All right? So what is an interval? I asked this question before. Okay, this is what an interval is really. It's like categorical perception in psychology. If you have white light going into a prism and it's separated into the colours of the rainbow, right? You think that those colours exist. Well, actually the colours don't exist. In physics you just have different wavelengths, right? You have a continuous scale of wavelengths. When you see the colours, they're psychological categories. Your brain creates the category red and the category green. When you're speaking and you say a, e, o, and you hear, if I say but and then I say bat, and you hear the difference between but and bat, this is called categorical perception in psychology. And it's the same like when I play this, and you hear one is a major third and one is a minor third. These are also perceptual categories. And so this is what an interval really is. It's a perceptual category that is learned from experience, just as these categories are learned from experience. I changed the shape of my mouth to say a or a. Right? If you listen to a lot of music and you measure the size of all the intervals between the tones, you would find that some intervals are closer to a perfect fourth interval and some intervals are closer to a tritone. So imagine this is a string quartet, right? We're counting all the intervals, and some intervals are closer to a perfect fifth. And if you imagine you're in the audience and you have no idea of music or music theory, the only information you get is something like this, a distribution of different intervals happening with different frequency of occurrence. This is how the brain learns what an interval is, right? It learns it from listening to music the way it really is, the way everything is always out of tune. Why do leading tones rise? Now, I'm not sure how many questions I can ask today. It's already, when am I going to stop this? 1:05
Well, but the discussion is included.
Yeah. So, did you know that leading tones rise more often than they fall? Well, they do, and nobody ever answered this question. I was wondering about this for many years. Why do the leading tones go up more than they go down? So, you see, we're used to seeing this F sharp going up to G. And then we say, when it goes up, we say, okay, the G is more stable, the F sharp is less stable, and that's the reason why it goes up. Well, there must be more to it than that. So we look at the definition of major and minor tonality. Here are the diatonic triads in C major, and we've got the leading tone here, which goes up part of the dominant seventh chord, right? And the diatonic triads in C minor also has this dominant seventh chord with the leading tone, right? And every music theory talks a lot about these leading tones. They define where the tonic is. So the leading tone is something important, and you would think that we would have a psychological explanation for it. And that explanation must explain why they go up more than they go down. Because you know that there's the tone F, when the tone F goes down to E, right? That's a falling leading tone. And when the B goes up to C, it's a rising leading tone. But we think that the rising ones are the main ones and the falling ones are not. So you could first ask the question, how old is the phenomenon of rising leading tones? And you find out it goes back to the 14th century. Here is a mass by Marshall. You can see the rising leading tones in music by Marshall from the 14th century. The notation is modern notation, and the sharp has been put in there by principles called Musicology. But you can still see in the modern notation that the rising leading tones are happening more often than the falling leading tones. And that means that an explanation based on dominant seventh chords is not going to be correct. It has to be a different explanation. You will also know about this double leading tone cadence, which was very common in the 14th century, going like this. The leading tones are going up and not down. Why is that? So that takes us back to Gregorian chant again. Here is the picture showing how often tones happen in Gregorian chant. The most common tone is G, the least common tone is B, which you call Ha. And an interesting point is that B happens less often than C, and E happens less often than F. So imagine every time you hear a semitone, in medieval music theory it's called mi-fa, the relationship between mi and fa. When you hear this semitone in chant, the higher note is generally happening more often. And we have psychological experiments which demonstrate that when a tone happens more often, you hear it as more stable. So this might be the origin of the rising leading tone, right there in Gregorian chant. And I'm not saying that there are leading tones in Gregorian chant. I'm saying the psychological foundation goes back to Gregorian chant. You may also know that Guido Arezzo, in his original notation, used colours, and he made the lines coloured if they correspond to ut or fa, which is like today's C or F. So there was already the concept back in the 10th century that the tones C and F are more stable than the tones B and E. So medieval listeners listened to the mi-fa semitone, associated it with a stability difference, and maintained that idea in Renaissance polyphony. And it somehow got stuck into Baroque tonality. So I hope this is the last call. How many questions should I ask today? Yes. Do you think I can ask another question before we stop? Missing fundamentals of music theory. Some chords are more common than others. That's really interesting. Here are all possible trichodes. Have you studied pitch class set theory? Pitch class set theory? You don't do that? You don't? Okay. So you can take the 12 tones in the chromatic scale and find all possible combinations of 3 notes systematically, and you find out that there are 17 or 19 trichords, and they sound like this. Many combinations, right? And these chords that you're familiar with, suspended fourth chord, diminished triad, minor triad, major triad, augmented triad, are just 5 out of that collection of all possible combinations. So a good theory of Western music should explain why some chords are more common than others, right? Don't you think? Well, we counted them. So we, first of all, in my lab, we decided we would find out which chords really are more common than others in different historical periods, in the 13th century, the 14th, and the 15th, and the 16th. And so we got a whole lot of vocal polyphony. We got music from different centuries in music notation, put it into the computer. The music was all vocal polyphony, right? We counted how often the chords happen in the music, and we found out that generally the major triad, 0-4-7 in semitones, is happening the most. These are prepared and unprepared chords. We distinguish between prepared and unprepared chords. A prepared chord has a note tied from the previous chord. So major is more common than minor in the 16th century, followed by the suspended fourth chord, which is like this one. Suspended fourth chord called 0-2-7, and then diminished. There are two other chords here called 0-2-5 and 0-3-5, which are like these ones. These chords don't have names in music theory. What should we call them? But they happen very often. So then we realized in order to explain which chords happen more often, we need to account for these data. If you do that, you find out the traditional list, major, minor, augmented, diminished, does not correspond to musical reality, because the diminished triad doesn't happen very often, and the augmented triad happens almost never. If you take a big database of music, augmented is amazingly uncommon. What really happens is major, minor, suspended fourth, 0-2-5, 0-3-5, and diminished. So 0-2-5 is this one, and 0-3-5 is this one. And a psychological theory to account for this is based on three factors. Chords are preferred if they are smooth, harmonic, or familiar. A smooth chord is one that does not make roughness in your ear. So roughness is like this. Like this sound. This is a rough sound, right? Chords that do not have roughness are preferred and more consonant. Chords which are similar to the harmonic series are preferred, and chords that you're familiar with are preferred. And so in this way we can account for that data that I showed you. So the reason why, the reason why the major and minor triads are so important in Western music theory is not because of some ratios, or it's not because they're natural, right? It's because they are consonant. They're consonant because they're smooth and harmonic and familiar, all right? And they're smooth because they have no minor second interval, which would be a rough interval, and they're consonant because they have a perfect fifth interval, a harmonic interval, right? And they're the only two possible chords with both of those things, a perfect fifth and no minor seconds or major seconds. Oh, sorry, major. That's a mistake. It should say no seconds. No seconds. What is the root of a chord? Now, I'm not sure if I should continue doing this because people must be getting a bit tired of this. Do you think I should talk about the root of a chord now?
Yes.
What is the root of a chord? Because this is also the foundations of music theory. Here are some jazz voicings of the same chord, right? So they sound like this. They're all the same chord, a C chord, except down here they're C minor. And jazz players know this. You can play a chord in many ways, and the root is not written down, right? The root is implied. It's not only in jazz, the root is often implied and not played in normal Western music. So where does that come from? We did an experiment to find out. So we played lots of different chords. There's one here called 015. It's like a major seventh without a fifth. That's the top left one. And the next one is 025. And the next one's 027, which is like a suspended fourth chord. And the next one is 035. And then comes 036. Diminished. Oh my god. Minor, right. So we played lots of different chords, and in the experiment, the listeners hear the chord, and then they hear a tone. Like this, and we say, how well does the chord go with the tone? And the result is on this graph. And I'm not going to explain this to you, but there's a very simple answer to the question, which tone goes well with the chord? It's the lower tone of a perfect fifth interval. It happens very often. So if we have this chord here, there's a perfect fifth interval, and the lower tone goes well with the chord, the lower tone of a perfect fifth. So this suggests that there's something about the harmonic series happening here, because the perfect fifth interval is like the third harmonic and the second harmonic, the ratio 3/2. So we can say from this experiment that the root of a chord is something about the harmonic series, which is exactly what Jean-Philippe Rameau said in the 18th century, except we say it in a bit more sophisticated manner. Here is the clock, which shows that it's time to stop this talk, because it's going so long. So we can put all of the tones of the chromatic scale onto this clock, because there are 12 tones on the piano and 12 hours in the half day. And then we can show the major triad here. So here is C. I should sing the right note, because some of you couldn't have perfect pitch, right? This one here. Da, ba, ba. We can put it on a circle here, right? It makes it easier, because we don't care what octave it's in. We only care that it's C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G. And here are the fundamentals implied by this chord. So C is the most important fundamental, because it's like the harmonic series, goes C, E, G, right? And then we have E and G, but we also have the tone A and the tone F. So what this picture says is that if you play this tone, it implies F. C major implies F, and C major implies A, because harmonics of F and A are present in the chord. And in this way we can explain aspects of the perception of the chord just by looking at which harmonics are implying which fundamentals. The minor chord works in exactly the same way. I won't go into that. And these profiles that I showed before from Karol Parncutt are in fact just the pictures that are implied by the tonic triad. So what you see on the left here is how often the tone C happens in the key of C major, or how stable the tone C appears to be in the key of C major. And here is F sharp here, seeming very unstable, and the tone B seeming unstable. This picture here is actually the perception of the tonic triad. It's like, how likely is that tone to be the root of the tonic triad? How likely is that tone to be the root? Which pitch is the most clear inside the tonic triad? And the same applies to the minor chord here. So this is C, E flat, and G. And interesting that E flat is, according to Karol Parncutt, E flat is more important than G inside the C minor key. And it's also predicted by this model about the roots of chords. So this seems very complicated, but there's a very easy way to look at it. So you heard about Schenker. Did you do Schenker analysis? Oh dear. Okay, yeah. Okay. You heard about, or some people did Schenker analysis. Anyway, so there's this guy called Heinrich Schenker who developed a new way of analysing music 100 years ago. And one of the things he said was that a passage of music in a major or minor key is a prolongation of the tonic triad. Right? So when you play, he said that chord progression is just a prolongation. It's like taking the tonic triad and making it longer, adding some decoration. Well, that's all I'm saying. I'm saying that this story about the perception of a major or a minor key, you can explain it just by understanding the perception of the tonic triad. That's where it comes from. So I think I have so many great questions. Foundations of, so I've finished now. Okay, so we've talked about what is a pitch, what is an interval, what is a scale, what is a chord, what is consonance, and what is tonality. So now we've done all of Western music. I think that's great. And I would like to answer your questions if anything is unclear. Probably a lot of things are unclear, but thank you for your attention. That's it.
Turning to applause, people like it, and it wasn't hard to follow. So we are in a question phase.
Can I just ask to repeat one slide that you showed? It was right after the consonants, and then it was talking about familiarity, and there was a lady with a trainer, something.
Ah, yes, okay, the trainer.
Because you were switching very fast. Yeah.
So Laurel Trainer, I think she agrees with me about this. If I talked to her, she would say yes. Actually, this was wrong what she said. But many people said things like this. So she said the effect of frequency ratio simplicity, whatever that is, on infants and adults' processing of simultaneous pitching. Cognitive psychologists talk about processing of information because they think our brain is like a computer which processes information. So this is how we understand music. And so they think the tones are going in your ear and your brain is looking at the waves. The waves are going up and down and the waves are related to each other. And if they coincide at the right places, then they're easier to process, right? And what I'm saying is this is completely wrong. because if a musical interval is easy to understand, it's because it's familiar. It's because so babies hear musical intervals in music and also inside every tone that we say when we're talking. This is another long story. Okay. So every time we talk, we make harmonic complex tones. Ah, right? When I say ah, the ear separates the frequencies, and this harmonic series pattern goes to your brain. Mm-hmm. So your brain is familiar with the musical intervals in a single tone, and it's happening already before birth, mm-hmm. according to some theories of pitch perception. And so I would say if a baby is somehow responding to certain musical intervals, it's either because they're inside every tone of speech, or because the baby is just hearing music.
But you mentioned before there was an experiment that they actually evaluate how the consonants is perceived, and right, if I understood correctly, and so the which chords are used most common, were most pleasant for the ear. I wanted to ask, when they interviewed people, was it just like same country people, the cultural difference people, because quarter tones, Middle East people, for example, they would think something sounds okay, and for us, quarter tone sounds like harsh, for example. So, when they do this kind of experiment, or when you did that kind of experiment, was it considering that aspect?
We've only done experiments with 12-tone chords. And so we played lots of different chords, and the people in the experiment have no idea what they're hearing, right? They just get one chord after the other, so they can't think about it. They just respond to what it sounds like, say they like it or they don't like it.
So it doesn't matter musician or musician?
Well, musicians, if the musicians recognize something, they might respond differently because they have a theory in their head. And sometimes if you do an experiment with non-musicians, they can't hear very well. They don't have the skill to hear the differences, and so the data is just blah blah, right? So sometimes you actually have to use musicians in the experiment, and you take the risk that they recognize some things, which influences their thinking, right? That's actually quite a difficult problem to solve sometimes. So the non-musicians can't do it, and the musicians are biased, right? That makes it actually difficult to test these theories.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in, did you do some history of music analysis?
No, we haven't. We've only done Western music. You see, if you might want to ask why I didn't do that, because I think I would have to be an expert on the music that I'm studying before I even start to think about those questions. And I also find that the Western music is quite complicated enough for me. People find this confusing, and I'm coming along with general kind of universal principles. I'm trying to explain Western music with universal principles, which sounds like culture-specific, ethnocentric theory, right? And I'm very aware of this problem, but I don't know another way to do it. It's like there are universal principles of perception, and different musical cultures use them in different ways. So,
Well, do you know someone who did?
well, no, I'm not sure exactly what that would mean in this case. You see, and I'm asking questions about perception of chords, which don't make much sense in any other musical culture, because
like intervals in raga, for example. How they are, how they're perceived.
This question is just too big for me. So interesting things about raga. There are different ragas with different meanings, and they get played at different times of day, and there are different stories associated with them, and those things are all completely different phenomena, right?
So it's all in perception and familiarity.
Yes, a lot of familiarity is going on, yes. So obviously raga...
It's the same for every kind of music.
Sure.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Sure. I mean, obviously in raga, the interval of an octave and a perfect fifth are absolutely essential to understand what a raga is, right? But so you could say, well, so what? I'm saying the interval of an octave and a perfect fifth is very important in Western music, and it's important in Indian music in a different way, but there's also a long historical connection where India and Western music had lots of interactions.
Some more questions? Please?
In your personal opinion, do you see classical music progressing related to pitch and notation? Like your example, do you think classical musician could be trained and, of course, with a proper instrument use that sort of notation?
Oh yeah, where's this notation going? I've lost it. I should be able to find it, shouldn't I? I just wrote this morning, I can't remember what I did. Where's it gone? Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay, so yes, I think it's actually quite possible. It was completely impossible for a long time, but now it should have been possible for about 10 years, because today we have computer programmers who know how to do things, right? So we can go to a scanner and put a piece of music on a scanner, and it can be converted into a computer score, and then the computer score can be converted automatically to another kind of notation. If that would work, then we would have an unlimited supply of notation in a different format, and in that case it would not be necessary to say that this notation system is the right one. We could have 10 or 20 different kinds, and people could choose their own, right? They could say, I like that one. And they would have an unlimited supply, and so then it would be worthwhile to learn to read it, and then some people would learn, and then they would start playing.
Do you see it as a reality in the future?
I think it would be a reality if some smart person who's good at computer programming put their energy into it and wanted to make money. And I think it would upset a lot of people. A lot of traditional Western musicians would say, oh, that's terrible, that's destroying our wonderful tradition, because musical scores are also a work of art, right? Musical scores are a beautiful thing with those wonderful symbols on them. And this person here with this stuff, they're destroying it. They're taking away the heart and soul of music, and there would be a discussion. I think it's an interesting discussion.
Feel free.
I'm sure there was another question. Somebody put their hand up and they put it down again. Who was that? Someone did that.
Because with asking questions, we could see what, how do you see all these what's you get in fact feedback from you react. Well, but is there some questions?
Yes. Thank you for the great talk. And this is just a clarification question. You mentioned that in chant there are different principles for some tones occurring more often than in chant than in tonal music. So I was just wondering about the tonal music, because if I understood correctly, in chant it is the audible harmonics of the individual tones that make them more appealing, and I didn't understand about the tonal music. What is the principle for some tones occurring more often than others?
Yeah, I should explain it again. What's the principle? I put it here somewhere. The root of the chord, and then I said here, okay. So in this picture, I said the root of the chord is normally the lower pitch of a perfect fifth interval, right? Which means that that tone sounds more important. So if I say, okay, this is the chord, and then I tell you that this is the root, somehow the root sounds more important than the other tones, right? And we need a theory to explain, in general, which tones sound more important. So Carol Parncutt played these chord progressions, and then she said some tones go best with the chord progression on this graph, and some are happening more often. And the question is why they sound more important, or they're happening more often. And I'm just saying the answer is because they're more likely to be the root of the tonic. So you know this is the root of the tonic triad here, but this is, the G is also a possible root. Now you might think that's a bit strange, but you know, if I play this chord progression, if I play a very simple chord progression, this is a subdominant, and this one here is called a tonic 6/4. What do you call a tonic 6/4? A second inversion.
Cadential 6/4.
A cadential 6/4. And so some people say we're playing in the key of C major. Some people say that's a C chord in second inversion. Other people say it's a G chord with a double suspension, right? So the Schenker theory says it's a G chord with a double suspension. If it's a G chord with a double suspension, the root is G, right? And that's this one here. This is the root of the chord. And so what I'm saying is that every tone in the chromatic scale could be the root of a chord, but most of them are very unlikely. This is another possible root. You could make E the root of a C major chord. So I could say, okay, I could say that's in root position. This is the root. And you'll say, well, that's complete nonsense. It's first inversion. But I'm saying, no, it's this chord. It's just an E minor chord with a suspension, right? So it's possible to hear that as a root position, and that corresponds to this note over here, right? And so we have a theory to predict what is the probability that a tone will be the root of a chord, and that explains how often the tones happen.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking this question. It gave me the opportunity at last to explain it properly.
But I didn't quite get, how did she arrive at this graph?
Okay, she plays...
Apparently she didn't have the theory to rely on, so I suppose, was it...
No, she had no theory, and she also complained when people said afterwards, what's the theory? She said there is no theory, it's only data. So she just played the chord progression, followed followed by a tone, and asked the people how well does the tone go with the chord progression. And they said, oh, it goes badly on a scale from 1 is very bad and 7 is very good. Right? She just collected this data.
Okay.
Yes?
I have a question. This lady here asked if that person who did that research, where did they collect that data? For example, if you have people who are non-musicians and they hear songs for whole their lives and they hear chord progressions and they are somehow more likely to say that G is more likely to sound good in that chord.
Yes.
I don't know if you understand me well.
Yes.
So if you have like a baby in African tribe who has no idea of
Yes.
other cultures, he would probably that baby would probably hear something different. So I don't know where did this came from, and maybe that is another question, like why is that C-E-G, why is that chord and that why is that the base of all tonalities, and where did that came from?
Okay, so you asked two questions. The second question, why is C-E-G the basis of tonality? That's because the major and minor triads are much more consonant than any other possible chord on the piano.
Yeah, I know
So
that,
that's one question. The other question is, what about the baby in the African tribe, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So Carol Crumb-Huntsell did say very clearly that this is based on familiarity with Western music, as it is, right? Because the tones that go together with the chord progression also happen more often, and you can count tones in as much as you want, and you find a very strong correlation. The tones that happen more often are perceived as more stable, right? So the question then is, why is the music like that and not some other way? And that is because for centuries in Western music we had this idea that the tonic triad is the foundation and everything is compared to the tonic triad, and we start from the tonic triad and we go away and we come back. So then you would say, okay, you should be able to change that. People from a different culture would perceive it differently, right? Well, it doesn't work very well because people from a different culture, well, people all over the world are hearing Western music all the time, so it's very hard to find someone who doesn't hear Western music. And if you do find them, of course you can measure different profiles. And there are some, there's some research in the literature about, for example, Indian listeners who listen to Indian music all the time and hardly any Western music ever in their whole life. And of course they have different profiles. Sure, when you play a melody and you say, how does the tone go with the melody, it depends on their experience. On the other hand, if you take musicians and non-musicians in Western culture, they give exactly the same answer. That's quite remarkably close.
Yeah, but when you give me a sec, just Ne, ne mogu, sad sam skroz spaničila sam se.
Šta hoćeš da kažeš? Can I help? Maybe what she wants to ask is, you talk a little bit about smoothness and roughness perception. Maybe you can explain a little bit more how is that measured for people, perception, because it can be subjective.
Yeah, that's exactly what I
Okay. So when I say roughness, I mean like, do you know sandpaper? What is sandpaper? Sandpaper. You feel it with your finger, and you feel the roughness because the tiny grains of sand feel roughness on your finger, right? And so when you play this rough sound like this, you actually you have a feeling of the roughness in your ear, but it's completely subjective.
Yeah, for example.
So we just do an experiment. Sorry. We say play different sounds and say how rough is it. That's it. And we have a theory which says that tones which are close together in frequency and cannot be clearly separated by your inner ear, by the basilar membrane in your ear, those tones sound rough because they're hard to separate between low and high frequencies.
but if the roughness or smoothness is subjective, there should be kind of common ground for people choosing the same music all over the world. So subjectivity has a certain spectrum. There's a common thing that everybody perceives the same, and there's a subjective perception that is different, right?
Yeah. Well, roughness, everyone in the world has the same kind of ear, and the ear is separating high and low frequencies in the same way in every culture in the world, right? And the semitone interval produces roughness in every culture in the world, right? And the difference between cultures is the aesthetic evaluation, which is aesthetic evaluation can be very different in different cultures. So, of course, in right now we're in Serbia, so I should talk about Bulgarian music or something like this, where people deliberately make roughness in a long tradition, oral tradition. People are singing rough intervals, and they love this sound because that's what they want to do, right? Well, you can think roughness sounds good or bad, but it's still rough, right? So there's a long tradition in Western music of thinking roughness sounds bad. So the idea that the dissonance has to be followed by resolution, right, is an absolutely fundamental idea in Western music. And so that implies that the roughness is a bad thing, but that's a culture-specific idea. So the roughness is universal, but the aesthetic evaluation is culture-specific.
When you say universal, that's from physics perspective?
Yeah, from physics and physiology.
Is it beats inside of a tone?
Yeah. Look, if we want to talk about musical universals, I should say in ethnomusicology, people often say there are no universals because every culture has its own identity and should be seen from inside the culture. But it's also true that every human being has certain physiologies. That the physiology of human beings has universals, right? So the way the voice works and the way the ear works and the way we move our body and the way children are born and the way children grow up, and there are many universals across cultures, and the universals of music only exist if they're attached to universals of human physiology, I think. So one universal of human physiology is the roughness that's produced by frequencies that are close together. Another example is the range of pitch of the voice. So men have deep voices and women have higher voices. Every culture in the world, there are small differences between cultures, right? And the range of the voice is like 1 octave, very approximately. The same all over the world, approximately, right? So they're universals. This is so medium tempo is like this, and fast tempo is like this. Right, and slow tempo is like this. This is more or less universal because it's the way you walk, right? That's the physiology of the body.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow for our second day.
Yeah.